Welcome to BigTent USA. My name is Kitty Douglas, and I'm the president of BigTent USA. We remain committed to defending our democratic values, the Constitution, and the rule of law, despite these turbulent times we are living through. Our goal is to empower you with facts, guidance, and calls to action so you can become a stronger, more effective advocate. I did want to tell everyone that we have never before had so many questions put in by registrants. There are 5 pages of single space questions from all of you. So we realize and can feel the intensity and anxiety and emotion that you are joining with us tonight. And we so appreciate that you're gathering under the tent. Our guests tonight are both returning to BigTent for a second time, and we're very honored to have them with us to explain all the illegal news. Joyce White Vance is a distinguished professor of law at the University of Alabama. She's a legal analyst for MSNBC and NBC and the author of the Civil Discourse newsletter. She co-hosts the podcast Sisters-in-Law and Insider with Preet Bharara, and she's a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama under President Obama. Exciting announcement from Joyce. Her first book, Giving Up is Unforgivable, a very apt title for today, comes out in October, and there'll be a link in the chat where you can pre-order. Marc Elias is the firm chair of Elias Law Group. Marc has successfully argued and won 4 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as dozens of cases in state Supreme Courts and U.S. Courts of Appeal. In 2020, you'll probably all remember, Marc led the historic legal efforts to protect voting rights, winning over 60 lawsuits against MAGA's efforts to suppress the vote. Marc is the founder of Democracy Docket, another essential newsletter for all of us on this call, the leading platform for the advocacy and information about voting rights, elections, redistricting, and democracy. Marc and Joyce, thank you so much for coming back to BigTent. So I thought I'd start this evening's call with this question. Are we in a constitutional crisis? And what is a constitutional crisis? And Joyce, I'm going to let you start with that.
So this is such a great question. It's something that we've all been talking about for a long time. I think this is sort of like a Justice Powell thing. I know it when I see it. I mean, there are some formal definitions out there, but from my point of view, a constitutional crisis would occur if there was a conflict between some of the branches of government, 2 or more of them, that they could not resolve according to our normal rules of order. And what I mean by that is we let the courts resolve disputes. Even the president does, Congress does it too. When you get into a situation where that normal order of business is no longer possible, then that's one path to a constitutional crisis.
I would add to what Joyce said. I think we need to distinguish between the facts that there are times when the executive branch and the courts disagree. There are times where it appears that the executive branch is not faithfully following the laws that were passed, and that when the judges issue orders, it seems like the executive branch is sort of dodging and trying to dodge between the raindrops. I don't think that's a constitutional crisis. I think we are much closer now than we've ever been. And I think we are, frankly, probably, when we look back, we'll say this past week was the week that one began. So I think we're at the beginning of one, because we, for the first time this week, saw a federal judge say that the executive branch, that the Trump administration and Department of Justice willfully violated his court order. This is about the planes carrying the Venezuelans to El Salvador. And what Judge Boasberg said is that the Department of Justice and the executive branch knew he had ordered those individuals not to be land in El Salvador. They did so anyway, knowing that that was in violation of an order, and finding that there is probable cause to believe that there is contempt. Now, probable cause for contempt is like the opening of the door. The judge hasn't yet jumped all the way through, and the judge also indicated that the Trump administration could purge the contempt, assuming that there is a finding of contempt. So, there are a couple of ways this could be averted. One is the judge could say there was not contempt. I don't think that's likely to happen. The second is that the administration could think better of where it has landed itself, and it could actually take steps to purge the contempt. In other words, to fix as best it can that problem. And then a crisis would be averted. I sort of suspect that actually instead the Trump administration is going to continue on its path of just telling the judge to go pound sand. And then we will be, as Joyce said, in this place in which, the courts have ordered something. The executive branch is willfully saying, we don't care what you have to say. And that will be, that I think would put us into a very different place than we've been. And like I said, I kind of think when we look back in time, we will see this week as the week that sort of kicked all that off.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is, this is not like the stock market, right? Where somebody rings the bell and it's opened. Nobody is going to formally tell us, okay, we are now officially in a constitutional crisis. I'm a little bit less optimistic than Mark is about where we are, for the simple reason that I think Donald Trump and this administration has given us plenty of reason to believe that they have no intention of avoiding a constitutional crisis. And so, as a former federal prosecutor and somebody who spent 25 years at DOJ, I listened to Pam Bondi, who's trying to dirty up someone, right? She's trying to talk really ugly about Mr. Abrego Garcia. And, I don't know as we sit here, is he a gang member? Isn't he? A couple of judges have said no, but I don't know what the facts are. And, it just doesn't matter to me one way or the other. Crook or saint, you're entitled to due process. End of story. And so to see an attorney general who openly disavows that, and I might add, while doing live interviews on Fox News with the White House behind her, that worries me. No attorney general should be that close to the White House. Your whole job is to be independent. That's a big part of the problem here and the reason I'm so deeply concerned right now.
So when you guys both watched the press conference with the El Salvadorian president in the Oval Office and heard Pam Bondi and Marco Rubio, what was your takeaway? What did you both think of that? Do you want to take this first, Joyce?
I mean, I think it was apparent to all of us that this was, made for television politics with no real concern about justice and the rule of law and doing the right thing. No recognition that a human being's life is at stake here. And whether, our broken immigration policy, that's Congress's problem, right? And they had the opportunity, by the way, to fix that. January of 2024, I think there's a compromise bill worked out, a bipartisan compromise. The Republicans get essentially everything that they want. And the Speaker of the House called it dead on arrival because Donald Trump did not want Republicans to let it pass. He wanted to be able to run on the issue of immigration. And that in large part is why we find ourselves here. But this breakage, this use of people to score political points, I think is distressing. And so there's maybe a better technical, legal, or political take on that White House moment. It just filled me with enormous sadness about where we are as a country.
Yeah, I thought it was a total disgrace. I mean, I just thought it looked like a bunch of college kids in a frat house, joking about the fact that they had stolen the mascot from, a competing college. I mean, you had Stephen Miller completely, pacing around and offering an opinion as to what the Supreme Court did. As far as I know, Stephen Miller's not even a lawyer. But offering an opinion that flies in the face of just completely in the face of reality. You had Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, who you might to Joyce's point, you might ask why the hell she was even in the room. What the hell is she doing palling around with these folks in a meeting where Donald Trump is meeting with the El Salvadorian president to talk about foreign policy other than to lend credence to the spectacle that was going on. Marco Rubio, has just turned out to be an utter absolute disgrace. I mean, Marco Rubio, if anyone had a question about whether Marco Rubio was in fact the little fraud that Donald Trump correctly identified him to be in 2016, he has proved himself that as Secretary of State. He just sits there on that couch trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, an absolute disgrace. And then you had the two presidents who were just yucking it up. I mean, they were just like yucking it up at the expense of this guy who was in the United States, was subject to a protective order precisely because an immigration judge said that if you send him back to El Salvador, he'll be mistreated. Right. I mean, that's literally the reason why he had that order saying don't send him to El Salvador. And you have, the president of El Salvador and the president of the United States just sort of making fun of it all and just finding it all hilarious. And it's so from my standpoint, both as a lawyer, as a citizen, as someone who's involved in politics, it was just an absolute disgrace. And it showed you the depth of the cruelty of this administration and how they take pleasure in the misfortune of this individual. It is not that they're indifferent. Indifferent would be way too kind to what you saw in the Oval Office there. It was, like I said, they were like a bunch of college students in a frat house thinking, look how clever we are. We just stole the other team's flag or mascot.
Can I just add to that? Because I agree with Mark so strongly here. And there's this moment in the Pam Bondi interview last night, whatever night it was, the days are running together. And she is saying that Mr. Abrego Garcia's wife and child would be better off without him. And she refers to them, American citizens, human beings. She says with scorn in her voice, that woman, that child, as though she can make decisions for them. And, my husband and I, our whole lives, we've told our kids, you can't play the Hitler card when we're having an argument at the dinner table. You can't compare something to Nazi Germany because you just can't. Nothing compares, right? And in that moment, you hear how she's talking about these folks, and you think we are perilously close to becoming a country where we don't treat human beings like they're human beings. We treat them like they're just, scum, less than us. Donald Trump loves to throw the word thugs around. It's such a dangerous and disturbing moment.
It does sound like that the Kilmer Garcia case is would you agree that this is going to be the case that sort of brings us to this line of constitutional crisis?
I was just going to say, I don't think they care. I think they'll take whatever case they can get to the court first to try to defy the judiciary's authority, because that's what this is about, right? Congress is supine. Congress has rolled over and played dead. Sure, take our power of the purse. We don't care. That's sort of the Republican view in Congress. And the question is whether this administration can now elude the ability of the courts to check them. And they clearly have the appetite for that fight. Abrego Garcia looks like it's on a fast track to get there. The Supreme Court said today that they would take up birthright citizenship next month in full argument. That looks to me like that'll be about whether or not federal judges can issue nationwide injunctions. So I think it's less likely that that's the constitutional crisis case, but one is coming, sure enough.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the way I've described this in what I've written for Democracy Docket is you basically have dry tinder, right? You have a dry forest floor, and the administration is running around with matches, like lighting them all over the place. And so at any time, any one of these judges can just decide they've had enough. And that case could be the one that accelerates forward. So, it's interesting because we're talking about the case involving the guy from Maryland being potentially the first case. But of course, the case that I described, that where a judge has actually gone further to find potential contempt, is actually a different case. It also involves individuals being sent to El Salvador, but it actually involves a case that Judge Boasberg in D.C. has heard that involves the Venezuelan migrants who were sent there after the judge had issued an order not to send them, not for no further deportations to take place there. But those are not even the only cases. I mean, just earlier today, a case that, my law firm and I are involved in, the involving an elections executive order. The president of the United States issued an executive order trying to essentially take over key aspects of federal elections. It violates the Constitution, and literally the first set of questions out of the judge's mouth were, to the Department of Justice lawyers saying, you told us in your pleadings that nothing had happened as a result of this order, right? That this executive order came down and nothing has happened. And therefore, essentially, nothing is therefore ripe, right? Because like nothing's happened. And yet, like 3 days after that, we now see there was an email sent from the Election Assistance Commission to the states saying, we need to consult with you about this executive order that we're under. And so the judges like, were you aware of the fact that when you said nothing happened, were you aware of this? And by the way, you had an affiant swear that nothing had happened. Like what, and so I just, and look, I don't think that judge is going to do anything with contempt or anything, but I am just astounded as someone unlike Joyce. Joyce has had the great honor and privilege and sacred obligation, honestly, of representing the United States. I've always been on the other side, and I've always felt like when I'm up against the U.S. Attorney's Office or I'm up against the Department of Justice, the judge starts with the presumption that every utterance out of the mouth of the Department of Justice is true, right? Everything they write in a brief is accurate. And that's an enormous advantage that the government normally has. And Joyce, I don't know about you, I've just been astounded at how quickly the Department of Justice has just like obliterated that advantage. They are just in case after case after case. Judges are finding these weird things where it doesn't seem like they're getting the full truth. So where does the constitutional crisis come from? I don't know. It could be any of those judges in any of those cases.
You raised such a good point about DOJ frittering away the moral high ground. I was always taught as a prosecutor and as a U.S. attorney, I recall a moment in training where we had a speaker, sort of an old DOJ hand, who used a powerful sort of example. He said, it's like a reservoir. It takes forever to fill up a reservoir, but one little hole, all of that water can leak out. And he said, that's what the integrity of the Justice Department is like. It takes us forever to build trust in our communities and to convince them that we really are here for justice, not just to, chalk up wins. And he said, we have to protect it carefully because one little pinprick and all of that is gone. And we're seeing now how true that is. And that is maybe not a constitutional crisis, but it's an institutional crisis, where having a functioning Justice Department that has integrity and that communities trust to have integrity, without that institution, we're in a lot of trouble.
I do want to ask a question. It was part of that meeting with the president of El Salvador, which was this sort of back conversation about Trump wanting to transport homegrown criminals, Americans to El Salvadorian prison. So I'd really like you guys to weigh in on that and sort of what alarm bells go off for each of you around that idea. It seems like they're laying the groundwork for being able to do this. Joyce, why don't you start?
Well, I think Trump talked about doing this during the campaign. Folks didn't pay a lot of attention, but it caught my attention because there's a huge Eighth Amendment issue here, right? The Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And by any measure, being sent to CCOT, this terrorist prison in El Salvador, would clearly violate the Eighth Amendment. And it's just this cagey approach the administration is taking with the with the Venezuelans that they've deported, where they've, said, and they've done this also with Abrego Garcia. Well, they're in this prison and now it's El Salvador's jurisdiction and there's nothing that we can do about it. Would they try to play that game with American citizens? I don't think that they would really be able to, because they would, in essence, be using a private prison. They would be hiring El Salvador to house American prisoners. That's not legal. That's not going to get very far. Assuming that due process still exists in this country, the courts will stop it before it begins. It does make me wonder if the federal government might turn to some of the state prison systems and suggest that they can do that. For instance, Alabama is in litigation with the federal government over conditions in its desperately overcrowded and dangerous state prisons. What if the feds offer them a way out? Well, you can get rid of your overcrowding issue by sending a third of your most dangerous population here. I mean, that seems like crazy sauce, right? In a normal world, I wouldn't be even raising that as a possibility. The problem is this administration is not committed to the rule of law, and they are very committed to this vision of people as dangerous thugs and themselves as the great saviors, getting these dangerous people out of the community. And that's not what they're doing, right? Instead, they're turning to college students, people with visas. They're sort of picking the low-hanging fruit because they're learning that these millions of people that they wanted to deport, that's not materializing. Well, here's another opportunity for them to talk about getting dangerous people out of circulation. And I think, unfortunately, we're at the point where the unthinkable now has to be contemplated as stuff that they might decide to try and do.
Yeah, look, I think I'm a little bit, I'm a couple of ticks more dire than that. I think that, Donald Trump ran a campaign and has run campaigns about illegal immigration and about undocumented individuals. We are less than 100 days into his presidency, and we already have green card holders. Okay, these are not people who are in any way, shape, or form here illegally. Like, these are people who did everything exactly the way they were supposed to, and we have green card holders being targeted. The individuals from Venezuela, the guy from El Salvador, from Maryland, right? These are not the in the main, in the case of the Venezuelans, and certainly with this gentleman in Maryland, these are people who were sent to El Salvador in violation of the courts, not in compliance with the courts. And we just have to keep that in mind, right? The reason why Judge Boasberg has found contempt is because a significant number, I don't know the exact number, of the Venezuelans who were sent there were sent in violation of a court order. The reason why there's a crisis with the individual from Maryland is because he was sent in violation of a court order, in that case, an immigration order. And so when Donald Trump says, next we do the homegrown, like, I am very, very worried that we have gone from, lawfully removing people who are not legally here to unlawfully removing people who are legally here. And if there is not really a public outcry there, and if ultimately the courts are held to be ineffective, even if they are issuing the right orders, if they are just held to be ineffective, I mean, if in fact the rule is that once he gets you out of the United States, there is simply no recourse, then that is a principle that is a rule that has no limiting principle. I mean, that's not a rule that just applies to the individuals who we're talking about. That means that if he gets if they get their hands on you, Kitty, and they manage to get you outside of the United States, there's like nothing under their theory anyone can do about it. And so, I agree with Joyce. I have always resisted the efforts by people, even well-meaning people, to equate any era to Nazi Germany, because I think it is an inapt comparison. But I will point out only this. The concentration camps in Nazi Germany didn't start as death camps. They didn't start as extermination camps. They didn't even start with focusing on Jews. I mean, the first concentration camp in Germany, opens in 1933, early 1934. And you don't wind up with them being really death camps and exterminate, routinely, the routine systematic extermination of Jews, for 4, 5, 6 years later. And so like I said, we're less than 100 days in, and we've gotten this far. So the question is, how much further is he going to get in the next 100 days, and in the 100 days after that, and in the year after that, and the year after that? And so, look, that's part of the reason why I think doing events like this are so important. It's part of the reason why, I think, paying attention to everything Joyce writes and says is so important. And it's part of the reason why, contacting your senators, which you started with, contacting your members of Congress, and voting in the midterms is going to be so important because fundamentally the courts are only going to be a check as far as they go, but we're going to need to have a lot of other tools in the arsenal.
Yeah. A couple people asked, besides holding, Trump administration officials in contempt, is there any other recourse for them that a court, any other tools in the toolbox for these, judges?
The courts are in some ways the least powerful branch of government if you read the Constitution strictly. But I come, obviously from Alabama, and many moons ago during the Civil Rights era, we had judges in what used to be the Fifth Circuit. Now it's the Fifth and the 11th. It used to run from Texas all the way to Florida until the circuit split in like 1979, something like that, 87. I always get the years wrong. But in any event, during the Civil Rights era, the judges on the Fifth Circuit, judges in the district courts, found powerful ways to protect the rights of people. They did it in a very different era. They did it with a president who was on their side. But I think one of the challenges the judiciary faces is understanding it does not have an army to enforce its orders, and it is going to have to be crafty about what it does. I think Judge Boasberg's contempt order is very interesting in this regard because, as Mark points out, he didn't jump straight to a contempt finding, and that's a little bit unusual. Instead, he says that there's probable cause to believe contempt was committed. He's giving the federal government the opportunity to cure it. He even suggested some ways that they could do it without imposing a lot of pain, without bringing people back to the United States. There are ways that they could cure the contempt and give folks their due process rights. I don't suspect that Judge Boasberg is doing that because he thinks that they're going to snap to and cure the contempt. I think he's doing it so the courts can say that they have given this administration every opportunity, that they have bent over backwards. And when and if we get to that breaking point, then the courts will proceed with a clear conscience. A lot has been made of the fact that this order that we saw out of the Supreme Court was 9-0. I have a little quibble with that. I would just say that nobody entered a dissent. Nobody registered a dissent. But I think it suggests that the Chief Justice, there was that delay of 3 days while Abrego Garcia's in CCOT in this prison under horrible, harsh conditions, and the Supreme Court appears to be twiddling its thumbs. And I suspect that that's because the Chief Justice was trying to get something that approached a consensus so that they could at least present a unified face. And there are probably, let's be candid, a couple votes on the court maybe to not go this far, but one suspects that there is a solid majority. And for the Supreme Court to speak and for a president to just blow that off, we understand that Americans get that. There was this press conference, with Chuck Grassley in Iowa, and a senior citizen stands up and teaches him, schools Chuck Grassley of all people, on what due process means. I think ultimately it's going to be the people and the courts working together, and we all better get ready because it's going to be a rough ride.
Yes. Mark, any comment on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I had the same, I posted this on Blue Sky, Joyce, that I thought people were making a mistake in assuming it was 9-0, and then I gave up because it seemed like everyone wanted to say it was 9-0. All we know is that there were 5 votes for that position, and that there were no justices who wanted their opposition or dissent publicly noted. So, I think we need to be a little tempered on the, that all of a sudden all 9 of them saw it the same way. Yeah, I've said to some folks that I think there are 2 impulses going on here. One is I think there are 5 votes on the Supreme Court, unfortunately, to say that the President of the United States has extraordinarily broader power than we all think. But there are also 5 votes on the Supreme Court to say that the president can't use that power to ignore court orders. So in some sense, like if the administration was smart, it would be, and playing a long game, it would be being very deferential to the courts and just appealing and letting these cases go up with a veneer of compliance by the executive branch to court orders, but a sort of a unitary president, unitary executive kind of, overlay. And they probably win a lot more. But by putting these cases up in the posture of contemptuous behavior, I think it's actually costing them votes. I could speculate as to which justices it's costing them, but I think it's costing them votes. And I think the chief is probably first among them.
I do want to move on to voting rights in the SAVE Act and also the Trump administration's executive order, basically, pulling the how we run federal elections away from the states and towards the federal government. So I would love to start with you, Mark, because I know you're part of a lawsuit, for us just to break it down, like what is the SAVE Act and why this executive order is so pernicious and frightening to you as someone who's just been working in this space for such a long time.
Yeah, so look, the SAVE Act is just the Republican Party's latest voter suppression bill. In this instance, what they're really going after is to make it harder to register to vote. If you think about it, there are like various phases of the voting process. There's who can register, who's able to vote, and whose vote counts, right? Those are kind of like three ways you could tackle this. And the executive order actually tackles all three. The executive order tries to both make it much harder to register, make fewer ballots count, and also throw out a lot of ballots. But the SAVE Act really focuses on that first one, which is, how does it go about decreasing voter registration, particularly among Black, brown, and young voters and women? Right now, what do all of those populations have in common? They tend to be more democratic in their voting. And I want to be precise about that because there's a lot of misinformation. People say, yeah, but, didn't Donald Trump do better? And the answer is, yes, he did better, but he still didn't win those populations, right? So it is one thing to say he may have that he did better among a certain population, but he is still overwhelmingly losing, for example, Black voters. So there is still a profound incentive on his part and on the part of the Republican Party to target those, to find bills that target those coalitions. And I just want to say, for people who hear this and think, well, that's awfully conspiratorial, I want to remind you that in 2013, this was the Republican Party of Mitt Romney. Okay, in 2013, a federal court in the state of North Carolina passed a voter suppression law that a federal court later determined targeted African American voters with near surgical precision. Okay, that's their words. And that was a bill passed by the Republicans of the Mitt Romney era in 2013. And one of the reasons why the court said that is because the Republican legislators, in putting that bill together, had asked for the various provisions that they were considering to be scored about whether they would negatively impact white voters or negatively impact Black voters. And they chose the provisions that would have the greatest impact on the Black voters and have the lowest impact on white voters. Okay. And so if they were willing to do that in 2013, just imagine with the increase in technology, right, to be able to write laws that target populations much more precisely. We see that in redistricting, but we see that in voting rights cases as well. And the shamelessness that comes with Donald Trump's Republican Party, right? They're not afraid of being called names. They're not afraid of saying the quiet part out loud. So when you hear people who oppose the SAVE Act say, as I do, and as Joyce has, and I'm sure many people on this call has, that the biggest effect of this would be to disenfranchise millions and millions of women who are married and change their last names. That is not an incidental effect of the bill. Like that's not like sometimes I listen to people and are like, oh geez, the Republicans must not have thought of that. Oh, no. They thought about that. Like none of these things are accidental provisions. When they pass this bill and they say, they have to prove citizenship. And the way you do that is through a passport or an original certified birth certificate. They know which populations have passports. Like that's like knowable information. And they know because you can use more sophisticated techniques through survey research and other stuff to figure out who is more likely to have an original birth certificate. Okay. And so that's my first point. My second point, real quickly, is let me just posit two things about this. Number one, they say, don't worry, because you can just get a birth certificate. Okay, let's set aside for a moment the cost issue, the convenience issue, and all of that. Let me think. Donald Trump and birth certificates. I know he said Barack Obama's birth certificate wasn't real. I mean, don't fall for this crap. Like, of course, they are setting up a regime that Donald Trump already has a history of impeaching birth certificates. I mean, when Barack Obama actually produced his birth certificate from Hawaii, go look at the clips. You don't take my word. They said that wasn't actually a real birth certificate. State of Hawaii is like, what do you mean it's not a real birth certificate? It's the thing we issue to people who are born in Hawaii, and they say, and the Republicans' position is it doesn't count. Second thing I just wanted to keep in mind here. So what is the first big executive order that Donald Trump issued? It's the case that Joyce mentions going to the Supreme Court, birthright citizenship. Now, what would happen if Donald Trump wins on birthright citizenship? Birth certificates no longer prove citizenship, right? Because, the reason why we say birth certificates are proof of citizenship is because of birthright citizenship. That is the reason why a birth certificate is always conclusive of citizenship. They are setting this up so that birth certificates won't count. Married women won't be able to vote without going through a whole lot of hoops if they change their last names. Young voters and others who don't have passports simply won't be able to vote because they won't be able to prove citizenship. And just wait till they start canceling people's passports, which will be another step after they go after the green card holders.
Well, welcome to The Handmaid's Tale. I hope that you all are enjoying the book and the movie version. Look, I think we're incredibly lucky to get to hear Marc Elias put it all together. And this is one of the reasons, and I don't really care if I embarrass you right now, Marc. I'm not sure if you're embarrassable, though, so I'm just going to say it. This is one of the reasons we are so lucky to have the Marc Elias with us tonight, but also working on our behalf. It's because there's a lot of history and trajectory here, right? Republicans aren't new to voter fraud. This was the modus operandi when I was at the Justice Department, in 2001, in that era, where Republicans, every time there was an election that they lost, they claimed voter fraud. But what's different about Donald Trump is that he sort of put it on blast, right? He sort of made it into a thing that mattered in an entirely different way. And so although state and local Republicans are continuing voter suppression measures in the state, we now have Donald Trump amplifying this notion that voter fraud exists when it doesn't, right? It just doesn't. I mean, it occasionally might impact a small, like a city council election, when it's just 3 or 4 votes that matters. I know that there's 1 or 2 of those hanging out there. It can't impact a presidential election, and it doesn't impact statewide or even big local elections. It's just not a thing. The thing is voter suppression. And that's what makes this all so incredibly frightening. This idea that they will that they will really stop at nothing to try to keep people that they are afraid will not vote for them from voting. That really, what I love so much about what Marc does is he puts it all together, right? And he can tell you how the SAVE Act impacts this birthright immigration stuff, and really that there is a method to the madness. And I think that that's what we're missing here, the big picture. And that's something that you should take away from tonight and talk with your friends about. Make sure that they understand this is about keeping American citizens who are qualified to vote from voting. It's not about keeping people who aren't citizens from voting. They don't. It is about keeping you and me from voting. And I guess I need to change my name back from my married name or do something.
Yeah, Joyce, what would that look like? There were a bunch of questions in the chat. If you changed your name, what would you have to, I mean, because I've had a couple arguments with people where they're like, well, I'm already registered to vote, so I'm okay, right? Even though I changed my name. But what are you seeing that the SAVE Act is going to do for women who are already registered to vote but did change their name? Like, can one of you explain that to us?
Well, right now, my understanding is that the SAVE Act and maybe the EO, I think the EO is worse. Mark sort of touched on that. But I think the SAVE Act impacts you at the point where you register or where you re-register, right? So if you're used to registering online, forget it. You can't do that anymore because you have to show the election official your passport. You have to do it in person. All the work that we did in Alabama to bring the state in compliance with the Motor Voter Act, where you could update your registration when you got a new driver's license, that's out the window. And so unless you're going to live in the same house for the rest of your life, at some point you're going to re-register. And if you're a woman, that's going to be more difficult. And I mean, I think we've all seen these painful moments where a reporter has asked a Republican official, well, so will this affect, my husband or just me? And the answer is always, well, it only affects you. And that's the point here. I mean, the point is, let's keep those uppity women from voting, not to put too fine of a point on it. And so for a president who was willing to use violence to try to steal an election in 2020, this is just more of the same. It's just a little bit quieter and dressed up in nicer clothing.
Yeah, and let me just add one thing to that, Katie. It is not an accident that this will not require, at least in its first iteration, and that put a footnote there because that's going to change. I promise you, if they get this, that's going to change. But in its first iteration, it will not affect people who are already registered. Now, why is that? Because if you wanted to have the maximum impact, okay, you wanted to have the harshest impact on young voters, what would you do? You'd impose it only on first-time registrants. When we talk about first-time registrants, what we're really talking about are young voters. These are people who are voting in their first election and are new to the voting process. And if you make it hard for them to register, they probably don't register because they have less permanent roots generally, and they don't have a history. They don't have a pattern of voting over a lifetime, so they don't register. So, when you say we're going to impose this just on new registrants, what you mean is no more mail-in voter registration, no more online voter registration. Everything has to be done in person, and you're only burdening new registrants. Well, who are disproportionately new registrants? Obviously, young voters, Hispanic voters, Black voters, right, are more likely to be new registrants. Now, you're also going to hit old people at the other end of the spectrum, people who have lived their life in one house and are now moving. They may be moving in retirement. They may be moving to live near relatives, whatever it is. But these are people closer to the end of their voting time than the beginning. Well, who have Democrats been overperforming with? The very young and the retired. And so when you look at this, it is just, I find it remarkable that people think that the Republican Party is so sophisticated that it knows how to draw lines to, discriminate against voters, by drawing congressional and state legislative districts in a really sophisticated way. And that is absolutely true. And people understand that. Do you think they turn off those brain cells? Do you think they turn off that technology when it comes to figuring out what rules of voting they want? When they decide who to target to make it easier and who to target to make it harder? They don't. And so that is a lot of what we're seeing. And we're just seeing it in a lot more blatant ways than we've ever seen it before. And one of the reasons is, and this is the thing I want probably people to leave with this call more than anything else, there's only two checks on Donald Trump. One is the courts. We've spent a lot of time talking about that, how imperfect it is as a check on Donald Trump, but it is a check on Donald Trump. He is losing most of the cases. Like underneath the surface, most of the stuff that he is trying to do is actually being blocked by courts. But the big check on Donald Trump are elections. Like that's the thing he fears more than anything else. You can be in the Trump administration and be anti-tariff. You can be pro-free trade. We can all point to people in the White House who have a history of being anti-tariff and pro-free trade, and they can be in good standing. You can be a former pro-choice Democrat and be the cabinet secretary over HHS. We know that. The one thing you cannot be in Trump's administration or in Trump's orbit is to believe in free and fair elections. You have to be an election denier. You have to be. They're all election deniers. You can't name me anyone who is in the Trump administration, who is not an avowed election denier in any position. And that's because he fears everyone on this call and all of the work you do around elections. And so these EOs and these laws and everything else to target elections, they are the critical thing for Donald Trump to maintain power and to be able to advance his authoritarian impulses.
Can I just add to that? Because I think all of that is true. One of the most powerful acts of protest we can all do is vote. And that might be a little bit harder at the midterms. And so I think it's, May 7, I think, is the cutoff date for real ID. You have to go get this driver's license with a star on it. Make sure you go out and get it and take friends with you, right? Make sure everybody has it. That in some states might be one path to register to vote. Getting a passport is like paying a poll tax if you're getting one to vote, right? It's an expensive way to secure your right to vote. But if you can, do, and make sure your kids get them. I'm fighting with my 22-year-old about why he has to have I just almost swore, why he has to have a passport. I'm so frustrated that he doesn't see it. The time to start thinking about this election is now, and whether that means volunteering to work, as a local election worker. A bunch of my neighbors have done that. It's really gratifying to hear them actually working the polls, be a poll watcher, work for a candidate. Find a way right now to be a positive part of the next election. I think that's the best thing that we can all be doing right now for democracy.
I really appreciate that, Joyce. And I did want to get to some things that we can do. I just want to very quickly ask a question from our friend Bonnie Fuller. Is there any power that the president has to cancel elections in the
No.
Constitution?
No, he's not going to cancel the election. He can't cancel the election. He's not going to cancel the election. I don't think the question is whether we're going to have elections in 2026. We're going to have elections in 2026. The question is whether they are going to be free and fair elections. And so rather than, and I'm glad Bonnie asked the question because I want to dispel this, but what I don't want people to do is to say all is lost. Maybe there won't even be elections, or they'll be hopelessly rigged, and then they stay home. What I need everyone to do is to not be defeated, not be defeatist, not assume that there is nothing they can do. Donald Trump wants you to feel powerless. He wants you to think there won't be elections, there's nothing you can do. And what I need you to do is listen to Joyce and become a poll worker. Organize your friends to get the proper ID. We may hate it, but like get it, right? Like, we need to do the affirmative steps rather than just assume it's all so terrible that there's nothing we can do.
So I did want to ask, and can we file a class action lawsuit?
Interesting question, right? And it comes up a lot. In order to file a lawsuit, you have to have a legal claim that you can prosecute. You can't just go into court and say, I hate Donald Trump and I think he's a terrible president, right? That's what elections are for. And so to go into court, you have to have a claim, and then you have to have standing to bring that claim. That means you've got to have a claim where you're being impacted and the court can fix your problem for you. And so the real problem that I see, and I've mulled this over and had this conversation with people a number of times, this idea of a big generalized class action, I just don't think would work. I don't think that there would be something that the court could do to fix the problem, right? They can't remove Donald Trump from office. What we're seeing instead are these strategic targeted lawsuits that are being brought. Lawsuits on behalf of government agencies that are being shuttered. Lawsuits, I think, that we'll increasingly see on behalf of freedom of expression at the university level. Lawsuits being brought for fired workers. And I really think that that's the path forward. These narrowly tailored sort of surgical strike lawsuits being brought by some of the finest lawyers in the country. And some of them are running into trouble. By the way, some of them are flagging, for instance, on standing grounds. So it's not a straight path forward, but I think this constant press of lawsuits that, Trump's not the only one who can play the delay game with the courts, right? And that's something that's important that's happening here. Either courts are enjoining the administration, saying, pause, while this litigation is underway, you can't put your heinous policy into operation, or at least we're forcing them to slow down before they roll out some of these irreversible abuses that they're contemplating. So I think that's the lawsuits that we want to see.
Okay, well, Joyce, I'm going to let you go. We so appreciate your time. There was so much love and appreciation for you in the chat. I hope you saw some of the comments. Everyone is so grateful to you and all that you're doing. And we hope you'll come back to Big Tent so we can talk about your upcoming book, Giving Up is Unforgivable. That's our mantra for tonight. And Mark, I just want to hold you for a few more minutes. Thanks, Joyce. Good night. I want to talk to you about your work at Democracy Docket and just make sure, are you worried about what is to come from the Trump administration? Our friends at Protect Democracy just wrote a great piece about that, that they're coming for the 501c3s, for the organizations like Democracy Docket. I know they've already talked about you. So what can we do to support you, and how are you feeling about all that?
Yeah, so look, I've written about this extensively and I've spoken out about it. Donald Trump has given a speech in which he gave a speech at the Department of Justice, which is, in and of itself, you know, a violation of a norm. But he gave a speech at the Department of Justice with, the head of the Department of Justice and the FBI and everybody else sitting there, in which he called me a bad person. He called me a communist who's trying to destroy America, which I find a weird sort of thing for a guy who hangs out with a lot of people who seem to be on Russian television a lot. But he has issued an executive order against my former law firm, targeting them, saying that they shouldn't be allowed to do all kinds of things because I was once a partner there. He has issued an executive order against the entire legal establishment, in which he predicates it based on the fact that he thinks that I am I'm an unethical lawyer. So look, I wear his scorn like a badge of honor. Donald Trump hates me because I beat him in court, and he hates me because I'm not afraid to speak out against him. And we need more people who are not afraid to speak out against him. I'm ashamed of what many of the large law firms are doing. It's a shame what many of the large media conglomerates are doing. And so in those two spaces, I'm trying to do everything I can. I started Democracy Docket in 2020 to be really a good source of accurate information about news, opinion, and analysis about what was happening in court. At that point, I was worried about Donald Trump lying about elections in 2020. Now, Democracy Docket has a much larger team, and we have 400,000 subscribers, and we put out a lot of content. So I hope everyone subscribes, and you can do that. And that's a great way to support the work, and also to just stay informed on what's going on. But I worry, but the question is not, Kitty, whether we worry. I'm sure you worry. I'm sure everyone out there is worried. The question is whether we take the worry we have and we take a step forward, or we take the worry we have and we take a step back. And I'm not going to be a guy that takes a step back. I'm going to be the guy taking the step forward.
Me too, Mark. I'm taking a step with you. So thank you so much. We're going to leave it there. I like that sentiment a lot. And I know you don't watch the chat like I do because
No.
it's a lot, but I just want to let you know there's so much gratitude and love for you too, Mark. And we really appreciate all that you're doing, and we're standing with you. So we're going to keep an eye and support Democracy Docket, and we hope you'll come back to Big Tent.
I will. And let me just give a shout out to BigTent, because, one of the things that people always ask me is, what can they do? People always want to know, what is the thing that they can do? And I always tell them that everyone's got a town square. Everyone has some group of people that they can reach out to and they can speak to, and they can tell them that what Donald Trump is doing is not okay, that we need to stand up for democracy. We can't allow him to send people to these camps in El Salvador without due process. And you exemplify, BigTent exemplifies that exact philosophy of having a town square, having a place in which you are willing to put forward ideas about what people can do and influence people one person at a time, to not let this go by without people being aware and without people feeling like they are engaged and being part of a community and having the ability to act. So thank you to BigTent. Thank you, Kitty, to you for doing this. And I hope everyone out there, they may not have thousands and thousands of people like you have, but everyone's got 5 people. Everyone's got 10 people. They've got a book club. Right? Like BigTent, I'm sure, didn't start with tens of thousands of people. It started with a few people. And so I'd ask everyone out there to, be part of the BigTent community, subscribe to Democracy Docket, sure, but build your own BigTent, build your own town square where you are spreading this information. Because if you do that, then you take what Kitty gives you and it multiplies, and it multiplies and it multiplies out. So thank you, Kitty, for everything you're doing.
Oh, well, all of us at Big Tent really appreciate you, Mark, and we appreciate everyone coming tonight. Look out for our invitation to talk at Loose in early May, and Mark will get you back here. And everyone have a great night. This is not, we're far from done, Mark. We're far
Yeah,
from done.
no kidding.
Have a good night, everyone.